May 14, 1944, dawn broke gray and wet over the jungle canopy of Bougainville. Mist clung to the mahogany trees like ghosts refusing to leave in a hastily dug foxhole near Hill 260. Private First Class. William Edward Kramer pressed his cheek against the worn stock of his Springfield M1903A4. His breath came slow and measured. The rifle felt like an extension of his body. It always had. Back home in rural Kansas, his father had placed a .22 rifle in his hands when he was 7 years old. "Respect the weapon, Billy," the old man had said. "It puts food on our table." Now, 12 years later and 7,000 miles from those wheat fields, that same philosophy would make him the most lethal marksman the Japanese Imperial Army had ever faced. What happened in the next 31 days would defy military probability and rewrite the tactical doctrine of jungle warfare. But more than that, it would expose a fatal flaw in the samurai code itself, one that American farm boys understood instinctively, but Japanese officers could never comprehend until it was too late. Stay with this story, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about courage, about class, and about why democracies win wars that empires start. The island of Bougainville represented everything wrong with the Pacific War from the Japanese perspective. What their high command had promised would be an impregnable fortress had become a bleeding ulcer. American forces had landed 6 months earlier in November 1943, carving out a defensive perimeter around Cape Torquina. The Japanese 6th Division, once proud victors of the Malayan Campaign, now found themselves trapped in a war of attrition they hadn't trained for. Their doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower, honor over tactics, and offensive aggression over defensive pragmatism. It was a philosophy forged in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and hardened in the conquest of Manchuria. But Bougainville's dense jungle made their beloved banzai charges suicidal. The Americans had transformed the island into a killing ground of interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and something the Japanese hadn't anticipated: individual soldiers who could think for themselves. William Kramer had grown up different from most American kids. His family's farm sat 30 miles from the nearest town in McPherson County, Kansas. Entertainment meant hunting. Survival meant shooting straight. By age 12, he could track a white-tailed deer through winter brush and drop it with a single shot at 200 yards. His father taught him to read the wind by watching grass bend, to judge distance by the size of a rabbit's eye, to control his breathing until his heartbeat became a metronome. These weren't military skills, they were economic necessities. Ammunition cost money. Wasted shots meant empty bellies. When the Depression hit in 1929, young Billy's hunting became the difference between his family eating meat or going without. He learned patience the hard way by sitting motionless in a tree stand for 8 hours waiting for one perfect moment. He learned to merge with his environment, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. The white-tailed deer of Kansas were skittish, intelligent prey with survival instincts honed over millennia. They demanded perfection from their hunters. Billy gave it to them. When Pearl Harbor exploded into American consciousness on December 7, 1941, Billy was 19 years old. He'd never been more than 50 miles from his family's farm. He'd never seen an ocean. He'd never met anyone who wasn't white or Christian. His entire world consisted of 320 acres, a one-room schoolhouse, and the endless horizon of the Great Plains. But he understood things that West Point couldn't teach. He understood that patience defeats aggression, that stillness conquers movement, that one perfect shot matters more than 1,000 wasted bullets. On January 3, 1942, he walked into the recruiting office in Hutchinson and enlisted in the United States Army. The recruiter asked him what skills he possessed. Billy shrugged. "I can shoot pretty good, I reckon." The recruiter marked him down for infantry. He had no idea he'd just signed up a weapon. The Army initially didn't know what to do with farm boys like Kramer. Their training doctrine emphasized volume of fire, unit cohesion, and following orders. Individual marksmanship took a backseat to tactical movement, but someone in the 37th Infantry Division recognized what they had during basic training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Kramer's scores on the rifle range bordered on impossible. He could hit man-sized targets at 500 yards with iron sights under any condition. Rain, wind, darkness, it didn't matter. His instructors tested him with moving targets. He hit those too. They tested him with surprise engagements, quick draw scenarios, and stress positions. He passed every evaluation with mechanical consistency. A captain from division headquarters drove down to watch him shoot. After observing for 30 minutes, the captain made 2 phone calls. Within a week, Kramer received specialized sniper training that most infantrymen never saw. They gave him a Springfield M1903A4 with a Weaver 330C scope. They taught him ballistics, range estimation, and target prioritization, but they couldn't teach him the most important thing. That came from Kansas. That came from 1,000 mornings, sitting perfectly still while deer grazed 30 yards away, waiting for the moment when everything aligned. The 37th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific in May 1942. They island hopped through the Solomons, New Georgia, Rendova, Vella Lavelle. Kramer saw combat for the first time on New Georgia in July 1943. The reality of war hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't deer hunting, these were men. They had families, they bled and screamed and died just like anyone else. The first Japanese soldier he killed had been running toward an American machine gun position, carrying a rifle with a fixed bayonet. Kramer's bullet caught him in the chest at 180 yards. The man folded like a puppet with cut strings. That night, Kramer didn't sleep. He stared at the jungle canopy and wondered if he'd become something monstrous. His sergeant, a veteran of Guadalcanal named Pete Morrison, sat down next to him. "You saved Thompson's life today," Morrison said quietly. "That jab would have killed him. You did your job." Kramer nodded, but the doubt lingered. This tension between the farm boy who respected life and the soldier who took it would define everything that followed. By the time the 37th Division landed on Bougainville in November 1943, Kramer had evolved. Combat had stripped away his innocence, but sharpened his effectiveness. He developed a cold, methodical approach to killing that resembled his hunting back home. He studied Japanese tactics. He learned their patrol patterns, their signaling methods, their command structure. He discovered something crucial that would make the next month possible. Japanese officers were identifiable. They wore different uniforms. They carried samurai swords. They positioned themselves at the front of units during attacks, believing that personal courage inspired their men. To Kramer's Kansas sensibility, this seemed insane. Why would leaders make themselves obvious targets back home? The book didn't advertise its presence. The smartest deer were the hardest to kill, but Japanese military culture demanded visible leadership. Bushido code required officers to demonstrate fearlessness. This cultural imperative would prove catastrophic when facing an enemy who didn't share their values. The Japanese 6th Division began its major offensive against the American perimeter on March 8, 1944. General Hyakutake Harukichi had been ordered to retake the airfields at all costs. He commanded approximately 15,000 troops against an American force of roughly 27,000. But Hyakutake possessed something he believed would overcome numerical disadvantage: the fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Army. His officers had trained their entire lives for this moment. They embodied samurai tradition dating back centuries. They would lead from the front. They would inspire their men through personal example. They would demonstrate that spirit could triumph over material superiority. It was a beautiful, tragic delusion, and it would get thousands of them killed. Kramer's unit occupied defensive positions along the Torquay River sector. His commanding officer, Captain James Hartford, recognized an opportunity. "Kramer," he said one evening in late April, "I'm giving you free rein, no fixed position. You pick your spots, you hunt." Hartford had grown up in Boston, the son of a Harvard professor. He'd never fired a gun before the army. but he understood human nature. He understood that some men function best when unleashed. Kramer nodded slowly. This was permission to do what he'd trained his entire life to do: hunt. The only difference was the prey. May 1st, 1944, Kramer moved into the jungle alone. He carried his Springfield 200 rounds of ammunition, 3 canteens, and a week's worth of rations. He'd studied Japanese attack patterns for months. He knew they favored dawn assaults. He knew their officers conducted reconnaissance before major operations. He knew they established forward observation posts to coordinate artillery. Most importantly, he knew they believed the jungle belonged to them. The American soldiers huddled in their defensive perimeters. The Japanese reasoned, while Imperial troops owned the shadowed spaces between the lines. This assumption would be their undoing. Kramer established his first hide on a ridgeline overlooking a trail the Japanese used to move supplies. He arrived 3 hours before dawn and built his position with techniques learned from hunting whitetail. Natural materials only. No disturbed earth. No broken branches. He became part of the landscape. As the sun rose, he watched through his scope. At 0637 hours, a Japanese patrol appeared. 12 soldiers led by a lieutenant. Kramer could tell the officer's rank by his sword and the way the others deferred to him. The lieutenant walked in front, consulting a map. Range 230 yards. Wind negligible. The moral calculation lasted 3 seconds. This officer would lead men against American positions. He would order banzai charges. He would kill Kramer's friends. The scope's crosshairs settled on the lieutenant's chest. Kramer's finger tightened. The Springfield kicked. Through the scope, he watched the lieutenant stumble and fall. The other soldiers scattered, confused, firing randomly into the jungle. They never saw him. Kramer remained motionless for 2 hours after they retreated. Then he moved to a new position 300 yards away. The pattern repeated. Kramer would study Japanese movements, identify officers, take his shot, and disappear. He never fired from the same position twice. He never took unnecessary risks. He applied deer hunting discipline to human prey. A whitetail buck will remember where danger came from and avoid that area forever. Japanese officers proved less adaptable. They continued leading from the front. They continued making themselves visible. They continued dying. By May 7th, Kramer had killed 9 officers. Japanese units in his sector began exhibiting confusion. Without their leaders, enlisted men hesitated. Attacks lost coordination. Some patrols simply stopped advancing when their officers fell. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical one. The Japanese response revealed their cultural blindness. Rather than changing tactics, they doubled down on traditional values. Division headquarters issued orders emphasizing officer courage even more strongly. To hide or take cover was shameful. To lead from behind was cowardly. Officers must set an example of fearlessness. This played directly into Kramer's hands. On May 12th, he killed 4 officers in a single day. One was a major coordinating an artillery barrage. Kramer shot him at 380 yards while he stood on a hilltop directing fire with hand signals. The major never heard the shot that killed him. 2 others were captains leading assault teams toward American positions. The 4th was a lieutenant who made the fatal mistake of using binoculars from an exposed position. Each death sent ripples through the Japanese command structure. Enlisted soldiers found themselves leaderless mid-operation. Unit cohesion collapsed. The carefully planned spring offensive began falling apart one officer at a time. American intelligence noticed the pattern before Japanese command did. Radio intercepts showed increasing panic in enemy communications. Units reported officer casualties at unprecedented rates. Some messages used the phrase invisible death. Shinomenai. A captured Japanese sergeant, wounded and delirious with fever, told interrogators about a rumor spreading through the ranks. American forces had deployed a demon, he said. Something that could see through the jungle itself. Something that killed with single shots from impossible distances. The interrogators dismissed it as superstition, but Captain Hartford understood. He visited Kramer's temporary positions when the sniper rotated back for resupply. How many? Hartford asked. Kramer cleaned his rifle methodically. 19 confirmed, he said quietly. Maybe 3 more I couldn't verify. Hartford studied the young man from Kansas. Kramer's face had changed. The boyishness had burned away. What remained was something harder, something ancient, the face of every hunter who'd ever existed. The Japs are terrified, Hartford said. Keep going. The Springfield M1903A4 became Kramer's entire world. He cleaned it obsessively. He knew every scratch on its stock, every minute adjustment of its scope. The rifle weighed 8.7 pounds. It fired .3006 Springfield cartridges at 2,800 feet per second. Maximum effective range with the Weaver scope was roughly 800 yards in ideal conditions. Kramer regularly made kills at 400 yards through jungle vegetation that would defeat lesser marksmen. But the rifle was just a tool. The real weapon was Kramer himself. His ability to read terrain, his patience, his willingness to remain motionless for hours waiting for a single target. His understanding that hunting wasn't about aggression, it was about merging with the environment until you became invisible. The Japanese officers trained to attack. Kramer had trained his entire life to wait. By May 20th, the count reached 26. Japanese units in the Torquina sector had effectively lost their entire officer corps. Replacements arrived from other parts of the island, but they died just as quickly. Some lasted less than 48 hours. The 6th Division's spring offensive had stalled completely. General Hyakutake couldn't understand what was happening. His intelligence officers reported massive officer casualties, but couldn't identify the cause. American artillery? Possible, but the deaths were too precise, too selective. Booby traps? No, the officers were being shot. By snipers? But snipers typically worked in pairs, took harassing shots, created chaos. This was something different. This was systematic elimination. This was one man conducting a private war against the entire concept of Japanese military leadership. The psychological warfare aspect fascinated American intelligence officers. A colonel from MacArthur's staff flew to Bougainville specifically to interview Kramer. The colonel came from a wealthy Connecticut family. He'd studied military history at Yale. He wanted to understand the strategic implications. Do you feel like you're making a difference? He asked. Kramer thought about the question. I'm doing what I'm good at, he finally said. Back home, if the deer got too plentiful, they'd starve over winter. We'd cull the herd. This feels similar. These officers, they're the ones pushing their men to die. Take them out, maybe fewer folks die overall. The colonel blinked. This wasn't military strategy. This was farm logic applied to warfare. But it was working. The colonel recommended Kramer for immediate promotion and a Silver Star. Kramer refused the promotion. I work better alone, he said. May 28, 1944. Kramer had been in the jungle for 27 straight days. He'd lost 15 pounds. His uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. He developed a slight tremor in his hands from dehydration and stress, but his eyes remained sharp. He'd established a hide overlooking a Japanese command post that had been erected 2 days earlier. Through his scope, he could see officers gathering for what looked like a planning session. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. 6 officers stood around a map table. One was a full colonel, the highest-ranking target Kramer had ever engaged. The range was 420 yards. The wind had picked up, swirling unpredictably through the jungle canopy. This was the shot that defined the difference between good marksmen and great ones. Kramer watched the wind. He observed how leaves moved at different elevations. He calculated windage using instincts developed over 10,000 practice shots in Kansas. The crosshairs settled on the colonel's torso. Breathing stopped. Heartbeat slowed. The world contracted to a single point. The trigger broke clean. Through the scope, Kramer watched the colonel collapse. The other officers scattered. Kramer worked the bolt smoothly. Acquired a new target. Fired a major fell bolt. Acquire, fire a captain. The remaining officers dove for cover. Kramer put 3 more rounds into their position, then melted back into the jungle. 6 shots. 3 confirmed kills. It was the most aggressive sequence he'd attempted. It was also the last. He'd reached 31 officer kills. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and something inside him had finally broken. That night, Kramer made his way back to American lines. He reported to Captain Hartford and submitted his patrol report. 31 confirmed officer kills over 31 days. Hartford stared at the number. It seemed impossible. Intelligence would later verify 28 of the 31 through Japanese document captured after the war. The other 3 remained probable. Hartford recommended Kramer for the Medal of Honor. It was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross because sniping in 1944 still carried a stigma that conventional combat didn't. There was something unsporting about it, something that made rear echelon officers uncomfortable. You were supposed to kill the enemy face to face, not from hiding. This attitude would change in later wars, but in 1944, snipers existed in a moral gray zone that troubled people who'd never had to make those choices. Asterisk, the Japanese 6th Division never recovered from Kramer's 31 days. Their spring offensive collapsed completely by mid-June. American forces began expanding their perimeter. By August, the Japanese were isolated into pockets that no longer posed a strategic threat. When historians later analyzed the Bougainville campaign, they focused on the larger battles, the artillery duels, the infantry assaults. Kramer's contribution appeared as a footnote. 1 sniper, 31 kills. Statistically insignificant in a campaign that cost thousands of lives on both sides. But the strategic impact couldn't be measured in body count alone. Kramer had decapitated an entire division's leadership structure. He'd created paralysis through precision. He'd proven that in certain circumstances, one skilled individual could achieve effects that entire battalions couldn't match. What made Kramer's achievement possible wasn't just his shooting skill. It was the fundamental difference between how democracies and empires prepared their citizens for war. Kramer grew up making his own decisions. His father taught him skills but expected him to think independently. When food ran low, 7-year-old Billy had to figure out how to track and kill game without supervision. He learned from failure. He adapted to circumstances. He developed the self-reliance that characterized American frontier culture. The Japanese officers he killed had grown up in a rigid hierarchical system. They were taught to obey, to follow tradition, to never question authority. Individual initiative was discouraged. Group consensus mattered more than personal judgment. When Kramer removed these officers, their men often didn't know how to continue without orders. They'd been trained to follow, not to lead. This cultural difference between societies that valued independence and those that valued obedience determined who lived and who died in the jungle. The symbolic weight of Kramer's Springfield rifle transcended its mechanical function. That rifle represented everything American abundance offered. It was manufactured by Remington Arms in Ilion, New York, using steel from Pennsylvania, wood from Walnut Groves in Missouri, and optical glass from Illinois. It embodied an industrial base that could produce millions of weapons without straining. Meanwhile, Japanese forces on Bougainville were starving. Their supply lines had been cut. Their ammunition stocks dwindled. They fought with equipment that couldn't be replaced. But more than material superiority, the Springfield represented a philosophical approach to warfare. It was a tool that empowered individuals. Japanese military doctrine emphasized collective spirit, but American doctrine equipped individual soldiers to make their own decisions. A Japanese infantryman fired when ordered. An American rifleman fired when he judged the situation required it. This distinction mattered more than any tactical manual acknowledged. Kramer rotated back to rear areas in early June 1944. The Army wanted to study his techniques. They brought other snipers to train under him. But Kramer proved to be a terrible instructor. He couldn't articulate what he did. You just feel it, he'd say when asked how he compensated for wind. You know when it's right. This wasn't mysticism. It was the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 hours of practice that had become unconscious competence. You couldn't teach it in a classroom. It had to be lived. The Army tried anyway. They produced manuals based on interviews with Kramer. They established sniper schools. Some of it helped. Most of it missed the essential element. You couldn't create another William Kramer through training. You could only find young men who'd grown up the same way and give them the same opportunities. The war ended in August 1945. Kramer mustered out in December with his Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Purple Hearts for minor wounds, and psychological scars he'd carry forever. He returned to Kansas and took over his father's farm. He never spoke about the war. When veterans groups invited him to events, he declined. When historians tried to interview him in the 1960s, he refused. His children grew up not knowing what their father had done. They knew he'd served in the Pacific. They knew he had medals locked in a drawer, but the details remained sealed behind a wall of silence. Kramer couldn't reconcile the man who'd killed 31 human beings with the man who now raised cattle and wheat. The cognitive dissonance was too great, so he simply chose not to think about it. In 1982, a Japanese veteran named Takeshi Yamamoto published a memoir about his service in the 6th Division. He wrote about the invisible demon that had terrorized his unit on Bougainville. He described the fear that paralyzed men when their officers kept dying from nowhere. He remembered how the offensive collapsed not because Americans were better fighters, but because Japanese soldiers found themselves leaderless and confused. A translator sent the memoir to various American veterans groups. Someone recognized the details and contacted Kramer. He was 60 years old, running his farm, minding his own business. The translator asked if he'd be willing to correspond with Yamamoto. Kramer thought about it for 3 days. Then he wrote a single letter. It said, "I was doing my job. You were doing yours. We both survived. That's enough," Yamamoto wrote back. They exchanged 6 letters over the next year. Neither man apologized. Neither sought forgiveness. They simply acknowledged shared humanity across an unbridgeable gulf. Then they stopped writing. Some things couldn't be reconciled. They could only be endured. Kramer died in 1997 at age 75. His obituary in the McPherson County newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It focused on his contributions to the Local 4-H program and his perfect attendance at the Methodist Church. At his funeral, a retired Army colonel appeared unexpectedly. He'd driven from Fort Leavenworth after hearing about Kramer's death. He asked if he could say a few words. The family, confused, agreed. The colonel told the congregation about 31 days in 1944, about a farm boy who changed the course of a campaign through patience and skill, about how military historians at West Point still studied those 31 days as a case study in asymmetric warfare. The family sat stunned. This wasn't the quiet man they'd known. This was someone else. After the service, Kramer's daughter approached the colonel. "Did that really happen?" she asked. The colonel nodded. "Your father was one of the most effective combat soldiers America ever produced," he said. "He just never wanted you to know about it." The deeper truth about William Kramer's 31 days transcends military history. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of freedom and its practical applications. Kramer succeeded because his entire life had prepared him to operate independently. He didn't need orders. He didn't need supervision. He needed only a mission and the freedom to accomplish it using his own judgment. This wasn't possible in hierarchical societies where innovation was discouraged and independent thinking was dangerous. The Japanese officers Kramer killed were brave. They were skilled. They were dedicated. But they'd been taught to think collectively, not individually. When that collective leadership was removed, the structure collapsed. American forces succeeded in the Pacific not because individual soldiers were superior fighters. In many cases, Japanese soldiers demonstrated greater tactical proficiency and willingness to sacrifice. Americans succeeded because their society taught them to think for themselves, adapt to circumstances, and improvise solutions without waiting for orders. This cultural advantage proved decisive. The rifle still exists. Kramer's family donated it to the Kansas Museum of Military History in 2003. It sits in a climate-controlled case with a small placard that reads, "Springfield M1903A4, carried by PFC William E. Kramer." 37th Infantry Division, Pacific Theater, 1942 to 1945. The placard doesn't mention the 31 days. It doesn't mention the 31 officers. It doesn't mention how one man with one rifle could reshape a battlefield through patience and precision. Visitors walk past it without understanding what they're looking at. But occasionally, someone will stop. Usually a veteran. Usually someone who understands what that weapon represents. They'll stand there for a long time, reading the placard, studying the rifle. And maybe, if you ask them, they'd tell you it represents more than just American firepower. It represents American philosophy. The idea that individuals matter. That one person, properly equipped and properly motivated, can change history. That freedom isn't just a political concept. It's a force multiplier that authoritarian systems can never replicate. The ghost of William Kramer still walks those Kansas wheat fields. You can find him in the patience of hunters who understand that success comes from stillness, not aggression. You can find him in the independence of farm kids who learn self-reliance because survival demands it. You can find him in the tension between the taking of life and the respect for life, between the necessity of violence and the tragedy of violence. Most of all, you can find him in the understanding that wars aren't won by systems or strategies or technologies alone. They're won by individuals who carry their cultures, values into impossible situations and refuse to break. 31 days, 31 officers, one farm boy with a rifle and the patience to use it. That's not just a war story. That's the story of why democracies endure.